Allah will answer that prayer for you. And so I kind of like nervously got up to pray, and I was like, oh gosh, what's my deepest wish going to be? And I think it was when I went into ruku, and I got back up. As I was going into sajda, it came to me. And as I put my head on the ground, I made my deepest wish. And it was, Allah, whatever your wish is, whatever you desire, whatever you have planned, is my deepest wish.
Wow. The mainstream media has been justifying genocide in Gaza. Islamophobia and censorship are the norm. We're changing that. Our journalism has reached over 300 million impressions on social media since October the 7th. On TV, our rolling news coverage has featured key figures like Hussam Zomlot, Avi Shleim, Gideon Levy, and Jeremy Corbyn. We need your support to reveal the truth and ensure our voices are heard. So donate today at support.islamchannel.tv. Ousman Noor is a human rights lawyer based in Switzerland, an alumnus of both the School of Oriental and African Studies and the University of Oxford. After graduation, he qualified as a barrister and worked in the field of human rights for 9 years from 2010. During that time, he founded the Habeas Corpus Project, providing legal advice and representation to migrants and asylum seekers at no cost. He later became a legal consultant for the Refugee Law Clinic and had a teaching post both at SOAS. In that time, he also headed his own legal chambers, and in 2019, he moved to Switzerland to practice law there. In October 2020, he took on a senior role for the advocacy group Campaign to Stop Killer Robots, or SKR. It's here where in January of this year, Ousman Noor became the subject of a controversial decision by SKR to terminate his advocacy work due to him advocating for Palestinian rights, especially during the current Israeli war on Gaza. Ousman Noor, welcome to the Islam Channel podcast.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here.
Let's dive straight into what happened at Stop Killer Robots. Do you want to give me a sense of what went on there, especially this incident in January which led to you having to leave the organisation?
Sure. Just to give you the context of what Stop Killer Robots is, It's an international coalition of 250 civil society organisations. It's led by some of the largest human rights organisations such as Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch. My role was government relations manager. So I essentially engage with the diplomatic community at the United Nations. I attend conferences and speak at the conferences on this issue of killer robots. Mm-hmm. So these are the new generation of warfare. It's artificial intelligence in weapons that get used to kill people. So we were advocating against that, and my role in 2023 was to spearhead a resolution at the United Nations General Assembly. It was going to be the first resolution on this topic. Okay. And I had been speaking with the diplomatic community over the course of 2023 to champion that resolution. I was then sent to New York for the General Assembly in October, and I was sent there between the 7th to the 14th of October.
This was just as part of your work?
That was part of my work. All year I had been, meeting different states, building up relationships with diplomats from different parts of the world, Germany, France, African states, Latin American states. And in October, we were going to be voting on this resolution at the General Assembly. So at the General Assembly, you get different resolutions tabled on different issues concerning disarmament and security. We had one on killer robots, and we were very proud of that resolution. We'd been working for that for a long time. And this was the last sort of stretch of lobbying work that I was going to be doing, which meant meeting with ambassadors, talking to different representatives of civil society in order to ensure that that resolution was going to be a success.
Killer robots, what is that?
So it's systems that will select and engage a target with force without a human. Okay. The human activates the weapon, and then it's going to be artificial intelligence that is processing data This data is captured from sensors. So we have different types of sensors. We've got visual sensors, auditory sensors, acoustic sensors. They capture data. Artificial intelligence then processes that data, and then the system is going to apply force, so a missile, a bullet, against that target, all without a human being involved. We call that an autonomous weapon system, and a killer robot is sort of the more standardly used phrase for an autonomous weapon system. And we've been campaigning against that because all sorts of problems arise when we use these types of systems.
So you're there in October of last year at the UN at a time when something was about to explode in global geopolitical terms in the Middle East. What was your resolution aiming to do, and what happened in terms of that explosion in the Middle East?
Well, our resolution was a fairly modest resolution. We were asking for the Secretary General to spearhead a process in which states and civil society would make proposals for a new framework. And we needed that resolution to be a success so that the Secretary General would initiate that process. I say it was modest, but it was still a lot of hard work to get to that stage because it is the new generation of warfare. Militarized states are spending billions on developing these types of technologies. There's essentially an arms race going on around the world right now to get one up over your competing rivals in geopolitical terms. And we had to galvanize the global south to take this resolution seriously in order to create some accountability to the states that are actually developing these systems. So it's the US, Israel, Russia, China, the more militarized states in the world who are developing these systems. So really my task was to speak to diplomats from global south states to say, look, if we don't take this seriously, this is going to be at your doorstep, and we need to create some accountability and get that through the United Nations General Assembly. And so this was exciting work. It's work that I was very passionate about. But yes, I was sent there at an extremely challenging time. I think I was just about to board the flight when the news came out about Hamas entering Israel and committing these atrocities. And when I arrived to New York, by that point, I got out the taxi and there were Israeli protesters everywhere in Manhattan. I was just a couple of blocks away from the United Nations, and there was a real strong sense of fear, not just in New York, but all over the world. And I was sort of just parachuted into this very challenging scenario where my job, talk about autonomous weapon systems, but also in this context where the whole security situation was under huge amounts of pressure. So that was the context in which I was sent. And, well, what happened? I carried on with my work. I have built up these relationships with diplomats who I talk to about human rights. I talk to them about dignity, about international humanitarian law, which is the law of war. And I take these things seriously. My job is to care about those things and to use these tools to advance our cause of creating new rules for autonomous weapon systems. And through that, you build relationships with these people, with ambassadors, and you take it in good faith that they also care about these rules. But what happened is suddenly the rules seemed to get thrown out the window. We were in the United Nations when, in the security chamber where discussions were taking place, where the ambassador of Israel was saying very, very dehumanizing things about Palestinians, describing them as savages and barbarians. And I think later in that week, Benjamin Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel, had said, is going to turn Gaza into a wasteland. And suddenly you realize that many of the people that we've been working with who have this outward sort of concern about human rights didn't seem to care about what was about to happen to Gaza. And it's a very jarring moment because I've been taking them at their face value about their concern about these rules, but suddenly there was this beating of the drum of war and a commitment to give Israel everything that it needs to invade Gaza. under the pretense of self-defense, which basically meant annihilating Gaza.
And how did that make you feel?
It was an extremely challenging situation. I was there with my colleagues at the Stop Killer Robots campaign, and I had this very difficult moment where I said to my colleagues, you know, we are here to talk about peace. Our entire endeavour is to promote peace, to speak out in these times. In fact, that's exactly what our campaign is built on. And so we have these relationships with officers in the Ministries of Defence and Ministries of Foreign Affairs. And we work very closely with them. My view was that we have a duty to say something at this time because we know what's about to happen. Anyone who knows anything about the history of...
Was it that obvious? You knew something big was going to happen in terms of Israel's response?
I think anyone who's got a small amount of understanding between the relationship of Israel and Palestine knows that when Netanyahu says they're going to turn Gaza into a wasteland, that's not an idle threat. And especially when the water and the gas and electricity had just been cut off and the indiscriminate bombing had started. So I reached out to my colleagues and said, we should do something. Yeah. You know, we have this important role in disarmament and peace. We have these important connections. And my view was that we have a responsibility to say to some of these colleagues who we've been working with on peace, don't commit genocide. You know, it sounds obvious. But so I did reach out to my colleagues, and the reaction was, unfortunately, be quiet about this. And I think the reason for that is more because they were concerned about their relationships with these individuals, diplomats, government officials, than they were about doing the right thing and calling out their actions.
Right.
So I did reach out and unfortunately was silenced. This was
silenced by your organisation that you were working with?
Yes, my boss basically, what I asked is for us to talk to our own campaign network, you know, the people who we built our campaign with, to advocate in favour of a humanitarian corridor. At that time, remember, that was what was being spoken about. People in Gaza didn't have anywhere to go. They still don't have anywhere to go. And I was suggesting, well, at least the least we could do, since there is indiscriminate bombing, is to advocate in favour of them being able to leave so that they can get to safety. And this request to talk to our own campaign was rejected. I followed up and said, look, this is an urgent situation. This is not something that happens all the time. And we know what's about to happen. And we, I think, have a duty to at least talk amongst ourselves what we should be doing. And I was told not to. And so it was an extremely challenging, emotionally challenging moment for me.
Okay.
And, well, what actually happened is I cried. I was in tears because I suddenly had this realization that all of these rules that I've been working so hard to protect and advocate for just didn't seem to matter at this particular moment. And I was left feeling very hollow because we knew that there was going to be this slaughter that's about to happen. And my own colleagues were not going to stick up for the rules. And I cried, actually. And at that time, I didn't know what else to do, but it was Jummah. It was the Friday, the 13th of October. And I decided...
So just after everything, obviously, yeah.
Yeah, so as I said, there were protesters coming out in support of Israel all over Manhattan. And I decided I just needed to be with people who, at least on my wavelength, who had the same recognition that I had. So I went to a masjid. I just looked up local masjid on Google and went to the nearest place. And the imam gave this beautiful sermon about what the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ would do in these circumstances. And of course, the Prophet was challenged with similar dilemmas in his lifetime. And he reminded us to act, to use our voice, to speak out against oppression.
Yeah.
But he also reminded us to do it without anger and to do it with faith, and that to know that Allah is with you and that Allah is the greatest of all powers, and therefore to not be in fear. And I was in the masjid, and you look around and you see other people's reactions, and I think there's this sort of mutual recognition when you look into the eyes of your own community where you're charged with this sense of responsibility.
What was the feeling really? Was it quite a somber moment for you?
Well, quite literally, I was in tears in the masjid. I know what happens when wars take place. I worked as a lawyer for refugees for 9 years, and I've seen the trauma that people go through, and I've represented people from these places where there is torture and sexual assault and all of these horrible atrocities, and so I have very sort of intimate knowledge of what kind of things are going to happen here. And I was just feeling devastated because I didn't know what to do other than to pray. And so I had this sort of moment in the masjid, and the imam said something, and I had a moment which I don't think I'll ever forget, because the imam said to the ummah that were there, take this opportunity to make your deepest wish to God.
Wow.
And I've never heard an imam say it that way. Like normally, pray for health, pray for your family.
Yeah.
And he says, use this opportunity to make your deepest wish. Whatever it may be, Allah will answer that prayer for you. And so I kind of like nervously got up to pray, and I was like, oh gosh, what's my deepest wish going to be? And I think it was when I went into ruku, and I got back up. As I was going into sajda, it came to me, and as I put my head on the ground, I made my deepest wish, and it was, Allah, whatever your wish is, whatever you desire, whatever you have planned, is my deepest wish.
Wow.
And Islam means surrender.
Oh, well, I was just about to say that is exactly what I felt when you just said that. Submission, total submission.
Exactly, and I don't think I've ever done it in such a sincere way as I had in that moment.
Sure.
Because what I remember feeling was to place my trust in Allah. Because I've got my ideas of what needs to happen. I've got my ideas of what's good for me. But it was this sort of surrender to say, actually, I no longer have those wishes. Whatever may come, whatever good or bad happens, whether death happens or victory happens, Allah knows better. And I just completely surrendered.
That must have given you enormous strength as well.
I felt much lighter afterwards. And I don't think I'll ever forget the feeling I had when that happened. So I then left the masjid after the Jummah prayers, and actually that evening the Stop Killer Robots campaign had organised a social event in a sort of trendy place in Manhattan, and I had been sort of inviting diplomats to attend that because we were doing it to build up support for our resolution. And so I left the masjid, and that event was that evening. And I had this dilemma about going to that event, but I decided I should, because that was my job to go.
Of course, yeah.
But as I was walking over through the streets of Manhattan, so far until that point, I'd only seen pro-Israel protesters. And there was literally a fork in the road moment where I was walking towards the street where the social event was happening. And suddenly, around the corner, I, for the first time, see sort of protesters coming out in support of Gaza, or coming out in support of peace, coming out in support of stopping the violence.
Yeah.
And I look at which way am I supposed to go here? And almost without thinking, my legs just turned in the direction of the protesters.
Peace protesters, yeah.
And it was it wasn't a very loud affair. It wasn't, you know, free Palestine or anything like that, actually. It was a very somber gathering. And I just turned my legs towards that. And I remember I saw a gathering of some brothers there who decided to get on the, I think it was Maghrib time at that point, who just put their jackets down on the floor and started praying. Yeah. And I just joined them again. But afterwards, you know, I wasn't in the mood to shout. I just felt like I needed to be with people who had made the connection about what was about to happen.
Yes.
And to feel a sense of comfort that I'm not alone. Because I till that point, I was feeling very alone. Because I'd be going in and out the United Nations, having this huge dawning sense of worry about what was about to happen in Gaza. And I wasn't getting that resonance from my own colleagues, or certainly not from the diplomats. I needed to be with people who also had that realization, right? So I think I stayed for a short period of time, and I went home to sleep. And I woke up the next morning and decided that I needed to say something. What
was that? What was that need? How was that need translated?
So I was staying a couple of blocks away from the United Nations. You know, I had the security pass to go into the United Nations. But actually, it was Saturday morning, so it was closed that day. But I felt I needed to say to stop the violence, to stop the ethnic cleansing that had just been announced.
Yeah.
Netanyahu had just ordered all of the people in northern Gaza to leave. That's ethnic cleansing,
yeah,
you know, by any stretch. I mean, this is displacing a civilian population through violence, and we know the history of that area where then that territory gets annexed. And
yes.
So this is ethnic cleansing. So all I did is I went to the gate of the United Nations in Manhattan and just with my mobile phone recorded a little message.
Okay.
And the message was, we are witnessing the premeditated ethnic cleansing of the people of Gaza. And we're witnessing this in the United Nations.
Yep.
We're witnessing that in New York and as observers all over the world. And we have a responsibility to speak out. So I urged people who, I didn't know if anyone was going to necessarily listen to my message, but I just felt I needed to say it.
Yeah.
And I actually invoked a memory that I had when I used to be a lawyer in London, which is when I went to visit the Holocaust Memorial in the Imperial War Museum,
mm-hmm.
where you go through this museum and you see how the Holocaust happened and the dehumanization and how people's own friends and communities have turned their backs on the Jewish communities. And you get to the end, you see the horror that takes place. You see the leftover of the clothes and the shoes of the people who have been gassed in these chambers. And you get to the end and there's a message that's written on the exit, which is that all it takes for evil to thrive is for good people to do nothing.
Yeah.
And I remember when I went to see that and I felt, wow, like, if this ever happens, you know, we need to do something. You know, we must be on the side of the people who do something.
Yeah.
So I actually just invoked my memory of doing that, and I said, that's what we have to do. We have to say something. And especially I felt we needed to, as we were the people who were in the security chamber, who were having these relationships with people who were making the decisions. And I said, we have to speak out. I said, we need to speak out against apartheid and occupation. And it was like a 1 or 2 minute video. And I then just made it on my personal Twitter and just shared the link for that to contacts on my WhatsApp.
Yeah.
So I sent it to friends and family and also the contacts that I had developed, whose numbers that I had on my phone. There's a whole there's a much bigger database of numbers that I didn't use. That is sort of the Stop Killer Robots database. I used the contacts that were on my phone, the colleagues that I'd sort of spoken to about politics and things, and I sent that out, and the backlash was severe.
Tell us what happened.
Well, my own colleagues, my boss in particular, first thing he said is, you're suspended. Don't send out any more emails. Don't communicate about this to anyone. And I was shocked by that, because I'd been working with the campaign for 3 years, and I had never had any disciplinary actions. I believe I was well respected and, you know, liked within the campaign. I was kind of, for this resolution, the front man for this resolution. I had worked all year to spearhead this resolution, and had done so very successfully. I think just literally the day before, I was in the sort of delegates lounge with the German ambassador, talking about, with my boss, you know, and being credited for that kind of work, and suddenly I was suspended. And the communication I received refers to my communication on Israel and Gaza, i.e. the tweet that I had made. So I was quite shocked, and I said, why am I being suspended? And so here I come back to how the campaign is structured, because the campaign is a coalition of organizations, but it's led by some of the world's biggest human rights organizations, representatives of those organizations who are part of the steering committee.
Yeah.
So I sent an email to the steering committee asking, why am I being suspended? And I gave a sort of chronology of what had happened since I arrived to New York, saying, you know, everything was going really well. I made this tweet. I told them why I made the tweet. And I said it was a very emotionally difficult thing to do. And I asked really for compassion, because I felt like I was, in a way, being betrayed by my own team. So I sent that email out, expecting perhaps like a disciplinary hearing to take place, where I would be able to flesh out
your case as well, yeah.
State my case. And, you know, my colleagues are humanitarians and peace builders, and I thought, you know, if anyone's going to understand me, it's these guys. But 3 days later, I was terminated entirely. My contract was terminated.
That must have been quite a rude awakening to the reality of advocacy work, where you can do certain types of advocacy, but there's one particular subject where you're not allowed to tread into.
Yeah. Indeed. And I think what I've been struggling to try to understand this ever since, because my view, and I think now basically the mainstream view, is that serious breaches of international humanitarian law are taking place. Ethnic cleansing is taking place, using starvation as a method of warfare, collective punishment, the types of indiscriminate bombing that we've seen. It's all taking place. And our entire rules-based order upon which we stand requires us to say, that's wrong. And now the International Court of Justice has said it's a plausible case of genocide. We are supposed to be speaking out for this if we are to maintain any sort of credibility to our adherence to international law. And all I had asked for was the rules to be applied. I wasn't even speaking up for Palestine necessarily. I was talking about the rules. So it did feel like, and still does feel like, the rules seem to apply to some people, but not necessarily to others. And that's a very difficult thing to swallow.
In terms of, I mean, there's quite a lot of issues you bring up there, and it's. I'm sure viewers listening to this will be moved as you are whilst you were talking to me. But can I ask, do you feel vindicated now, so many months later? Because, like you mentioned, the ICJ, a plausible case for genocide. We are hearing now that the Western governments are now having to ban arms sales to Israel because international humanitarian law has been broken, particularly the British government. There's been advice just over the last few days that this is this is actually taking place. And even the shift in the US's position over the course of the 6 months, they're still supplying arms to Israel, but they're having to be a lot more vocal about what really is going on.
Yeah.
So my question is, do you feel vindicated?
I never felt in any doubt about the truth of what I was saying in the first place. I didn't feel like I needed to wait until these things happened in order to feel like what I was saying was true.
Yeah.
And in fact, all I felt for the last few months is a sense of horror about what's continuing to happen. So
what happens next with you? I mean, what are you doing in terms of your campaign against SKR?
Well, what happened is I was terminated. There was an internal appeals process which I exercised. The way that unfolded was, in my view, incredibly unfair. So not only was I terminated, but my profile on the SKR website was deleted straight away. My email account...
You became persona non grata.
I was persona non grata. It was total isolation. My email account, which I'd been using for 3 years, was restricted, so I couldn't access it. I had this UN grounds pass, which was revoked immediately. And then an email was sent out from my boss to all the diplomats that I had developed relationships with. I think it was like a few hundred people, saying, Ousman has left the campaign. You know, we wish him well. Please vote yes on our resolution. And I didn't even get that email. It was sent to everyone but me. And I actually found out about it because some diplomats wrote to me saying, hey, what's going on here? We were having coffee 2 days ago and you were talking about autonomous weapon systems and everything seemed fine. Why? And the way that the email was phrased suggested that I had resigned, whereas I had explicitly said to the steering committee, I'm not resigning. I'm not resigning. So I was put in this position where I was having to explain to people, there were 7 or 8 different people who had messaged me saying I haven't resigned. And so then they was like, well, what's going on then? I said, look, this is what's happened. I've just been terminated. And then I found out this email had been sent to loads of people who knew me, right? So it was
a stain on your reputation as well in some respects.
Yeah. So I then just sent out an email saying, this is what's happened. I haven't resigned. I've actually been terminated. And so the affair became public.
That's where I picked it up as well.
Yeah, so it wasn't by design that this was intended to be public. I never intended to be in this confrontation with my colleagues in any way. You know, my initial instinct to speak out was an emotional, spiritual need to speak out at that point. I wasn't gunning for a fight with my colleagues who I'd helped build this campaign as well. You know, I didn't want to harm the campaign, but it became public because people were asking me what's happened here, and I was having to explain. And then this appeals process just became more and more, well, disastrous. Thankfully, though, many people within the campaign had seen what had happened and called out what the leaders had done. Someone started an online open letter which got nearly 2,000 signatures saying, you know, Ousman was a well-liked, respected person in the campaign. We don't think this should have happened. You know, you should restore his email access, allow him to conduct this appeal fairly, because I was deprived of even accessing my own documents. So that then took on its own shape. You know, then suddenly quite big names in the tech sector were saying, hey, what's going on here? And this is wrong. And it started to take its own. And then people resigned. Some people resigned from the campaign, citing racism in the campaign, a lack of accountability and a lack of responsibility in the campaign. I sought an acknowledgement from the leadership at this point of wrongdoing. I was saying, you know, I should not have been fired for this. In fact, our own vision and values that we publish on our website say that we are actually supposed to do what I did. So I then, because it had become public, there was a question of reputation, where insinuations had started to be made that, I was a bad egg or something like that. And I then needed to protect my own reputation. In my history of working as a barrister for 9 years, I'd never had any disciplinary finding against me. I'd never been in trouble with the law. My reputation is valuable. I worked hard for it. So to protect myself from those insinuations, I then my fight has been for an admission from the leadership of wrongdoing. Okay. Now that hasn't been provided, and now it's going to court for unlawful dismissal in Geneva.
Well, we'll keep a close eye on what happens there, and we'd obviously like you to come back at some stage for us to continue the discussion, certainly about what took place at SKR, but also about yourself. You're from the UK. You grew up, I believe, in Birmingham.
Yeah.
And I think it's very important for people to understand, just in a sentence, why did you choose to be a human rights lawyer?
I think I became interested in politics during the Iraq War. It was a very divisive time in British politics. I think I was about 16 or 17 when that war began. And I became sensitized to global politics because of that war. And then I started to learn about colonial history. I did an A-level in history, and I was like, oh, wow, there's things that I didn't really know about, suddenly reading about the history of what happened in India and Pakistan and Kashmir and other parts of the British Empire. And I became interested in this pursuit of truth and justice. And as I went to SOAS, which is, got almost a reputation for sort of decolonial literature, anti-colonial literature. So I became interested in justice from learning about what had gone on in the history of the British Empire. Yeah. And I became a barrister because I was learning more and more about, people who were affected by the Iraq War, who had been displaced by that war. By that point, Libya, the bombing over Libya had started as well. And I was hearing of people who were destitute, who had been tortured, who had gone through horrific travel to come to the United Kingdom. And I guess a little bit as well, my mother had given me a strong sense of justice and orientation towards justice. And I felt, I've got these accolades, these certificates. Why don't I do something with that? And I decided to get into legal practice. And the cases that I started to take were people who were failed asylum seekers who were trying to appeal. And I, through that, started focusing in on the sort of human rights, detention work, victims of human trafficking or modern slavery, or people who actually represented quite a few people from Gaza who were getting scholarships to come to the UK, but were being rejected by the Home Office because they were saying that you're not a genuine student. This was sort of a mechanism the Home Office can use to refuse to give someone a visa. So I was doing that kind of work and challenging the Home Office, and I did that for 9 years with a passion. I started this law centre called the Habeas Corpus Project to provide free representation to people in detention. Not many people know that much about how detention works in this country, but you can, if you're someone without a status, you can be detained without a court order, without a trial, without a judge even. You just get picked up and you get put in prison. Oh, so this is outrageous. And so I started to get involved, and through that I became impressed with people who had gone through these struggles, because yes, they are victims of a horrible apartheid in a way, in the sense that they, because of the virtue of their nationality, are only allowed certain things, certain rights, whereas people with a different nationality are allowed different rights. So I became interested in that line of work, and was impressed with the people who were driven by a sense of hope to go through that, and I enjoyed it.
Well, Ousman, you've been... what can I say? It's been an emotional journey for me as well, just to listen to your journey. And we'll be keeping a very close eye on that, folks. Ousman Noor is a leading human rights lawyer, somebody who stood up for his beliefs in very difficult circumstances, and the story hasn't finished. He continues his fight for justice, somebody who was brought up with a strong sense of justice, somebody who is fighting not just for the rights of Palestinians, but also for the rights of the downtrodden across the world, because if those who are standing up for justice can't speak out at times like these, then we certainly are in very dystopian times. Ousman, thank you so much for joining us, and hopefully we'll have you back to talk more about this and other matters.
Thank you so much. It's been an honour to be here. Thank you.
Thank you.
Assalamu alaikum.
Assalamu alaikum.